light gaze on her. Oksana wanted to forgive him. Now she possessed his secret, and he could not see her as he had before. After 3 or 4 songs, she went over to his table herself. The Russian giant blocked the path to his boss as if she were a murderer or beggar. But Oksana would not allow herself to be intimidated. The Korean stopped the physical exchange, whispered a few words to the Russian, and he translated for Oksana. At midnight, same services, same price. The Korean didn't stay until Oksana finished her set, so he missed one of her best songs about a teenager who'd gone missing and a tiger without claws. When she finished, the black car was waiting for her. The Russian glared at her with contempt, almost with sorrow. "You're either a nut or a jerk," he said between his teeth. Oksana ignored him and remained silent during the ride, focused on the snow-covered sidewalks and the darkened buildings. The wine flowing from the Sea of Japan scorched the streets' lamps and the trees, as if it wanted to pull them up by the roots. The sky was black, black. The Korean received Oksana in his purple robe. She stripped diligently, following the pre-established ritual, and allowed him to touch and sniff her. He seemed even more needy than before. Then Oksana stretched out on the bed and waited to receive him on her belly. But he tried to excite himself on his own before getting into bed with her. His erection only lasted a few seconds. He moved to the side and sat on the bed. Oksana approached him very delicately. He looked as if he might fall apart and caressed his cheek. Pretending it was a transaction like any other, the gangster took out his wallet, removed 2 100 bills, and handed them out to Oksana. She shook her head in refusal, but he forced to take them. There was no emotion in his eyes, not even a hint of sorrow or shame. Nothing. Oksana quickly dressed, and it wasn't until she reached the street, whipped by the gods from the Sea of Japan, that she felt the painful need to shout. Back in her apartment, she discovered that her lungs hadn't stood up to the wind. Fever was burning her skin. This time the heat was working. Outside it must have been 10 or 12 degrees below zero, but her body was shivering as if she were outdoors. Her joints ached, her chest, her throat. She was delirious. For a moment she thought she was in a room in the Fontanka Palace, and thought that she too had bought about the end of an era. Then she dreamed that the tiger without claws was leaping on her. When she awakened the next morning, the sky was still uniformly grey. She found she was covered with sweat. She was no longer feverish, but she was coughing as if her lungs were filled with worms. She washed her face, looked in the mirror, and thought she would die. She quickly made some tea and sat down at her desk. Anushka was waiting for her there, sober and brave, with her blue dress and her orange shawl covering her arms. Oksana thought she was looking more and more like her. Her fingers revived, and they seemed like fires that flew next to me until dawn, and I never managed to find out what color those strange eyes were. All around, everything trembled and sank, and I didn't know if you were friend or foe, if it was summer or winter. For 2 weeks, Oksana couldn't sing. The doctors at the regional clinic told her that the antibiotics were scarce and only gave her enough for a couple of days. Her voice sounded like the blow of a dying animal. It might well have been. The days she spent in bed, locked up with the shadows and moisture of her Chateau Benista street flat, Oksana regretted not being able to make her date with the Korean. As absurd as it seemed, she felt who was betraying him. But she wrote as if possessed. She filled the blue notebook and had to use the back of the pages she'd already covered with writing. Now she no longer spoke about lost love or Vladivostok, the ghost port, or about the Korean, but about an idea that began to slip through her purses. What if she were the only surviving member of the human species, the last woman on Earth? What would it mean to sense the absolute extinction of the race? The idea was so disturbing that she barely managed to control herself. What would that silence hide? Her fingers took control of the pencil once again. But there is no power more formidable, more terrible in the world than the prophetic word of a poet. On her 13th day of convalescence, Oksana went back to the dive. The Korean and his entourage arrived punctually through the Korean. So she couldn't know if she'd come on the nights she'd missed. The temperature had fallen to 28 below zero, and the sky shone with a strange luminescence. It was as if the time had petrified, as if the universe has used up its minutes. Even the wind from the Sea of Japan had stopped blowing. Except for the Korean and his bodyguards, they were only two other customers in the bar. A bald, toothless man and a thick, greasy stevedore, both attracted by the heat and the alcohol, not by the music. The audience barely mattered to Oksana. This would be the best performance of her life, she decided, and nothing could change that. Before beginning, she looked for the Korean and focused her gaze on him. The halogen lights made Oksana's skin go from blue to blood red. Her voice still sounded harsh and cavernous. She sang some of the poems she'd written during her convalescence. It was the gift she was preparing for the Korean. Oksana held her guitar as if it were a fluorescent device and howled with all her strength. And that would be for the others, like the times of Vespasian, and that was a wound and a cloud above of storms. This time, there was no need to come to an agreement to a price. The Korean left halfway through her set, and the Russian giant waited for Oksana in his black automobile. The sky was still ablaze with a whitish glow. Vladivostok never seemed so peaceful. The branches on the trees were not supposed to move, and didn't. The night birds were not supposed to flutter around, and they didn't. The night was supposed to seem eternal, and it was. "Why do you do it?" asked the Russian as he drove her to the broken-down hotel downtown. She shrugged her shoulders and stared at the empty streets and distant shining. The Korean received her wearing his purple robe. Oksana undressed calmly. The Korean sniffed her armpits and her sex. Oksana got into the bed. The Korean took off his robe and leaped on top of her. Oksana caressed his back and the nape of his neck. The Korean remained erect. For an instant, their eyes met, and both knew what would happen next. The Korean went to the bathroom. When he came back, he was holding a knife. Oksana admired its shine. Like prisoners who leave jail, we know something about the others, something terrible. We find ourselves in a circle of hell. Perhaps we aren't even ourselves. And she thought about Zhenya, her mother, and Anyushka, and about the world as a wasteland. And she said to herself, "Season of Ash." Thank you. Wow.
The chapter that Jorge read is an illumination in many ways, because it leads the reader